Do you ever notice how the smartest person in the room often says the least? How they nod along when someone's clearly wrong, or play dumb when they obviously know the answer? You probably thought they were just being humble or polite, maybe even insecure. But what if I told you they're doing something far more calculated? Something Carl Jung spent decades studying in his patients, those brilliant minds who deliberately hid their intelligence like it was a dangerous weapon they couldn't let anyone see. Here's the thing that'll mess with your head. The people pretending to be stupid aren't the ones you think. And the reason they're doing it has nothing to do with humility. Jung discovered something dark about human intelligence, something that explained why geniuses throughout history disguised themselves as fools. And once you see it, you can't unsee it in your own life. Let me paint you a picture. There's a kid in school who finishes tests first, but waits 15 minutes before turning them in. A coworker who solves problems, but frames them as questions. A friend who knows 5 languages, but pretends to struggle with directions when traveling. These aren't isolated quirks. Jung called this strategic diminishment, and he found it everywhere among his most intelligent patients. But here's what's wild. They weren't even consciously aware they were doing it half the time. In his work, Psychological Types, Jung documented case after case of brilliant individuals who'd created what he called a shadow persona, a dumbed-down version of themselves they presented to the world. One patient, a mathematician, told Jung he'd been pretending to not understand basic concepts since childhood, not because he was modest, because something inside him knew that showing his full intelligence was dangerous, and Jung realized this wasn't a bug in human psychology. It was a feature, a survival mechanism that developed for a reason that goes back thousands of years. Think about it. In any social group throughout all of human history, what happened to the person who was too smart? The one who had all the answers, who saw through the lies, who pointed out what everyone else missed. They got isolated, resented, sometimes worse. Jung traced this pattern back to something he called the collective unconscious, this deep ancestral memory we all carry. And buried in there is a warning that smart people inherit without anyone teaching them. In his book, The Undiscovered Self, Jung explained how human tribes operated on consensus reality. Everyone had to believe roughly the same things for the group to function. The person who saw too clearly, who questioned too much, who understood things others couldn't grasp, they became a threat to that consensus, not because they were wrong, because they were right. History is full of this. Galileo had to recant what he knew was true about the solar system. Socrates was forced to drink poison because he asked too many questions. Tesla died broke and alone while Edison got rich off simpler ideas. The pattern repeats so often, it's become embedded in our psychology. Jung found that intelligent people inherit this fear on an unconscious level. Before they even understand why, they start moderating their intelligence, hiding it, wrapping it in jokes or questions or deliberate mistakes. One of his patients told him, "I learned by age 7 that being right made me wrong in everyone else's eyes." That sentence should haunt you, because it's probably true in your life too, in ways you haven't noticed yet. So how does this actually show up? How do smart people pretend to be stupid without even realizing they're doing it? Jung identified several patterns in his clinical work, and they're disturbingly common. First, there's strategic confusion. This is when someone clearly understands something, but acts uncertain to avoid threatening others. They phrase statements as questions. They say, "I might be wrong," but before sharing something they know is correct. They create plausible deniability for their own intelligence. You see this everywhere once you notice it. The analyst who says, "I'm probably missing something," when presenting a solution they're certain about. The student who pretends homework was hard when it was easy. They're softening their competence so it doesn't create distance between them and others. Second, there's deliberate error insertion. Jung noted patients who would intentionally make small mistakes in their work or speech, mispronouncing a word they definitely knew, getting a minor detail wrong in a story, pretending to forget something obvious. These weren't accidents. They were strategic humanization, because here's the dark truth. People bond over shared limitations. When you're too competent, too knowledgeable, too capable, you become unrelatable. You stop being human in others' eyes and become something alien, something that makes them feel inadequate just by existing. So smart people learn to stumble, to struggle publicly with things they mastered privately, to create false points of connection through manufactured weaknesses. Third, there's what Jung called intellectual submission. This is when someone defers to authority or popular opinion, even when they know better. They let the boss explain something they already understand. They don't correct misinformation if it means contradicting the group. They choose social harmony over truth. And here's what makes this so insidious. It works. The people who do this are more liked, more included, more socially successful than those who don't, which reinforces the behavior until it becomes automatic. But Jung didn't just document this pattern. He saw what it did to people over time. In Modern Man in Search of a Soul, he described a phenomenon he called self-fragmentation. When you consistently hide your intelligence, when you perform stupidity often enough, something inside you starts to break. You begin losing track of what you actually know versus what you pretend not to know. One patient told Jung she would sometimes genuinely forget information she'd hidden too many times. Her brain started treating her act as reality. She dumbed herself down so consistently that the dumb version started feeling more real than her actual intelligence. Jung saw this create profound psychological problems. Depression that came from living as a fraction of yourself. Anxiety from constantly monitoring what you could say and couldn't say. A deep unnamed loneliness from never being fully seen or known by anyone, including yourself. He wrote, "The greatest burden a person can bear is the unlived life within them. And for intelligent people performing stupidity, that unlived life is massive. It's all the thoughts they didn't share, the problems they didn't solve, the conversations they didn't have because they were too busy pretending to be less than they are. Think about how exhausting that is. Every interaction becomes a performance. Every conversation requires you to calculate how much intelligence you can show without triggering resentment. You're constantly translating your actual thoughts into a simpler, safer version that won't make others uncomfortable." Jung found that many of his most intelligent patients weren't suffering from traditional mental illness. They were suffering from self-imposed exile from their own minds. Now here's where Jung's insight gets really disturbing. He discovered that this pattern creates a trap that feeds itself. When smart people hide their intelligence, they attract relationships and environments that reinforce the hiding. They end up surrounded by people who know and like only the dumbed-down version, which means revealing their actual intelligence would destroy everything they've built. In his work on the persona, the mask we show the world, Jung explained how people become imprisoned by their own disguises. The mask gets comfortable, it gets familiar, and eventually, taking it off feels more dangerous than keeping it on. He had patients who'd built entire careers around being the relatable one, or the humble expert, or the approachable genius. Their income, their friendships, their identity, all of it relied on maintaining the performance. Showing up as fully intelligent would blow up their life, so they stayed trapped, using maybe 30% of their actual capacity, knowing they were capable of so much more but unable to access it without losing everything. Jung called this voluntary diminishment, but there's nothing truly voluntary about it. It's a response to a social reality that punishes full expression of intelligence. The smart person who hides isn't weak. They're adapting to an environment that would reject them otherwise. But here's the paradox Jung kept returning to. By adapting this way, they guarantee the very isolation they're trying to avoid, because nobody actually knows them. They're surrounded by people but completely alone, because the person everyone knows is a fiction. In Jung's framework, anything you deny or hide becomes part of your shadow, the unconscious parts of yourself that leak out in unexpected ways. And unused intelligence creates one of the most volatile shadows possible. He documented how patients with hidden intelligence developed strange patterns, sudden outbursts of condescension, dreams about being locked in cages or trapped in children's bodies, fantasies about scenarios where they could finally show everyone how smart they really were. The intelligence doesn't disappear just because you hide it. It goes underground. And from there, it sabotages you in ways you don't recognize. Some people developed what Jung called intellectual grandiosity in private, inflated self-importance that compensated for their public diminishment. They'd privately despise everyone while publicly playing nice. The gap between their hidden self-image and their performed image created tremendous psychological tension. Others swung the opposite direction into imposter syndrome. They'd hidden their intelligence so long, they started believing maybe they weren't actually smart. Maybe the act was the truth, and the intelligence was the delusion. They'd look at their accomplishments and feel nothing, because they achieved them while operating at a fraction of capacity. Jung spent years helping patients integrate their hidden intelligence back into their conscious life. And he found it was one of the hardest therapeutic challenges, because it meant confronting not just individual fears, but collective ones. So why does this happen? Why do groups instinctively push back against intelligence? Jung's answer is uncomfortable, but makes sense once you hear it. In Civilization in Transition, he explained that intelligence is inherently destabilizing to social systems. Not because smart people are trying to cause problems, because intelligence reveals problems that everyone else wants to ignore. Every society runs on necessary fictions, things everyone agrees to believe, even though they're not quite true. The intelligent person is dangerous because they see through these fictions, and once they point them out, everyone else has to either admit they were fooling themselves or attack the person revealing the truth. Groups choose the second option almost every time. Jung observed how this played out historically. During times of great change or uncertainty, societies became more hostile to intelligence, not less. They doubled down on simple narratives and punished complexity. They celebrated folksy wisdom over expertise. They turned anti-intellectualism into a virtue. Sound familiar? He predicted this would get worse, not better, because as the world grows more complex, the gap between those who can understand that complexity and those who can't grows wider. And that gap creates resentment, which gets directed at the intelligent as if their intelligence caused the complexity rather than simply revealed it. Smart people sense this dynamic unconsciously, so they hide, they simplify, they pretend the world is simpler than they know it is, because that's what the group needs to believe to stay cohesive. By now you might be thinking, so what's the answer? Should intelligent people just stop hiding and let the chips fall where they are? Jung's answer was more nuanced than that. He didn't advocate for radical honesty or full self-expression in all contexts. He understood that social adaptation has value, but he did believe there was a middle path that most people miss. In his later work, Jung talked about individuation, the process of becoming fully yourself despite social pressure. For intelligent people, this doesn't mean performing your intelligence everywhere. It means being consciously aware of when you're hiding it and why. The difference between healthy adaptation and psychological damage is consciousness. When you strategically choose to downplay your intelligence in a specific context for a specific reason, that's fine. When you automatically, unconsciously suppress it everywhere without even realizing you're doing it, that's where the problems start. Jung encouraged his patients to find what he called sanctuary spaces, places, relationships or activities where they could express their full intelligence without performance. A journal, a mentor relationship, an intellectual hobby, somewhere the mask could come off. He also pushed people to stop seeing their intelligence as something that needed constant management. The fear that drives the hiding is often outdated. Yes, human groups can punish intelligence, but not all groups, not all contexts, and certainly not to the degree our ancestral memories suggest. Part of individuation is testing those fears in safe ways, sharing one true thought you'd normally hide, solving one problem you'd usually leave alone, letting one person see your actual intelligence instead of the performed version. What Jung found over and over is that the catastrophe people feared rarely happened. Yes, some people reacted badly, but others didn't. Some were relieved. Some were attracted to the authenticity. Some had been hiding their own intelligence and finally felt permission to stop. Look, here's what Carl Jung understood that most people miss. Intelligence isn't the problem. The hiding is. Every time you dumb yourself down, every time you pretend not to understand something you grasp perfectly, every time you let someone else take credit for your idea because speaking up would make things awkward, you're not being humble. You're fragmenting yourself, and over time those fragments add up to a life that doesn't feel quite real. A career that doesn't use your actual abilities. Relationships where nobody knows the person you actually are. Jung spent his life helping people put those fragments back together, not by becoming arrogant or showing off, but by slowly, carefully, consciously choosing to stop performing stupidity as a default. The smartest people aren't the ones who show off their intelligence, but they're also not the ones who hide it reflexively. They're the ones who've made peace with it, who can turn it on or dial it down based on conscious choice rather than unconscious fear. So here's my question for you, the one Jung would ask. How much of your intelligence are you living versus performing away? How much of what you know do you pretend not to know? How many thoughts do you have that never leave your head because you've decided they'd be too much for people to handle? And most importantly, what would your life look like if you stopped pretending even just a little bit? Because Jung's warning wasn't just about the cost of hiding. It was about the cost of never finding out who you could have been if you'd stopped performing stupidity long enough to discover your actual capacity. The smart people pretending to be stupid aren't tragic because they're hiding their intelligence. They're tragic because they'll never know what they could have done with it. Don't let that be you.